Welcome to this episode of Random Guy number 6. Today I'm going to be doing a full kitchen transformation. I'm going to be painting the ceiling, painting the walls, painting the cabinets, and all of the trim. So let's get to it. First things first, mask absolutely everything. Get a really good masking tape that will seal the edges like frog tape. This will keep the paint from bleeding through on areas that you don't want paint. Regular old aluminum foil works greater on irregular objects. On the floor I'm also using frog tape around the edges and then covering everything in a thick heavy cardboard to protect the floor and still make it usable for traffic, since the kitchen will still be in use throughout this project. Now that I got the masking all done, it's time to actually work on this project from the top down. So there's a lot of stuff on the ceiling that needs to be fixed, so let's start there. So here's an old patch job. I'm going to try and fix the texture that's on there, and then they must have done some type of remodeling here where there's some new texture and then you can see the old texture. All I'm gonna do right now is just try and knock this texture down a little bit. I'll fix this stuff later, but once I get the texture knocked down so it's a little more like the other texture that's there, we'll fix all this kind of stuff. I'm just gonna quickly finish up sanding all of that irregular texture and making all of those edges smooth. Now I've mixed some regular joint compound with some water, and I'm going to use that for the texture. Now I got this handy dandy little texture tool, and it's great for small little projects and things like that. Now I've mixed this pretty soupy because it's a really light texture, so that's not bad. There's a couple high spots, but when it actually dries, I'll just knock it down with a knife and it should look pretty good. So here's the final result. It's not perfect. When we put some paint on it, it's probably gonna hide it a little bit better, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was. Now I've gotta make sure I plug up all of these gaps just to give it a more finished, polished, and professional look. No need to be perfect when you're putting the caulk in the gap. Just make sure that you fill it and then take your finger and smooth it out as best you can to get that seamless look between the ceiling and the cabinets. The last thing to do on the ceiling is paint it, so let's go throw 2 coats on it. So you're gonna wanna pour out about 3/4 of your gallon. Keep about 1/4 of it in the bucket so you can use that with the brush to cut in the ceiling. Since I'm painting all these cabinets, I don't need to be super careful when I'm cutting this edge in. I can just get, as close as I can. If I get a little extra on there, it's no big deal. I cut all of my edges in first and feather them out, and then roll everything out all at once. Always put at least 2 coats of paint on your ceilings and walls, regardless of what the manufacturer says. The ceiling is all painted, dry, and looking pretty, so now it's time to move on to the next step, which is gonna be to remove all of these door and drawer fronts. So let's get to it. Most of your newer doors are gonna be pretty easy to take off. There's just a little button back here, or like a switch, and you just kind of flip those off. If you have some older ones, you'll just need to take the screws out here, but we're still gonna take those out as well. This particular kitchen has a bunch of different doors and hinges and hardware. So if you're reusing the hinges, which if you're a DIY homeowner, I would most definitely suggest you do, then try to keep everything organized by keeping the hardware in the cabinet you took it off of. Just leave it right there on the shelf right when you unscrew it. Now that all the doors and drawers are removed, it's time to start the prep work on this. So the first thing I'm gonna do is sand everything down, so let's get to it. So we're gonna need a few different things to sand this all down. First and foremost, some kind of mechanical sander. Now they have some like this that are, squares that do the exact same thing. I like this because it has a larger surface area. And basically any flat surface area that you can get to that is easy, you wanna get with this. It's just gonna do a better job than you can do by hand. Next, you're gonna want some of these stripping pads. If you have like some of the trim here is like rounded or concave, and this will work great on that. And then just a regular block for areas you can't get with the sander. So you can see these nice big flat areas. I can just get the sander in here. Now my goal is just to scuff it up. I'm not trying to take this all the way off because I just need the primer to stick. So I'm scuffing it up and also cleaning it kind of at the same time. Then we've got these ultra rounded areas, and that's what these are for. As long as you scuff it real good, then the paint's gonna stick. Really take your time on this part of the process. You want to get every little nook and cranny humanly possible. Being that this is a kitchen, it is highly likely that there is food and oils that will need to be removed from all areas before any paint will stick. The first thing I want to tackle now is going to be this big, ugly, mismatched gap. Now, I'm going to attempt to use some of this Ready Patch, and I'm going to put some in and probably do it in a couple coats. So this stuff is fairly easy to use. You just put some on your putty knife, and I'm just going to mash it in there. That should be good enough. We'll let that dry and sand it smooth. So this is dried overnight. You can see here it's kind of sunk in a little bit. So I'm going to sand this down. We're going to put in another coat. This time I'm being a little bit more precise in how I apply the patching, with the intent of having considerably less sanding, since this is going to be the finished edge. Moving on to all these ridiculous holes, I'm just going to take some of this Plasti-Wood and fill up all these holes. It's super easy to work with. Basically just grab a gob of it and jam it in the holes. Make sure you push it in as far as it'll go in, because this stuff does dry basically as hard as wood, if not harder. It is sandable, and I will be able to put new screws through it. So once it's dry, we just sand it smooth, and then it's ready for paint. The final thing to prep is going to be all of these big gaps. So I'm just going to go around and fill everything in. Take my finger and smooth it out. Since it's all getting painted, it'll all disappear. So probably the most difficult question you're going to have is, what paint do I buy? And there's really no simple answer. So, you know, things are always changing, things are always getting better, you know, formulations are getting changed. Normally everything gets better. Just because there's old school ways to do things, that doesn't necessarily make them the better way to do them. So I would suggest kind of figuring out how you're going to paint first. You know, are you going to spray anything? If you're not going to spray anything and you're just going to roll everything, you can go with the thicker style paint. Now, I'm going to be spraying all the doors and rolling all of the, you know, actual cabinets here. So I picked a thinner paint just to make it easier to spray. This is my first time trying out this Behr stuff, but it seemed like it would work for my application. Make sure you mix it up no matter what you do. And I tell you what, I am not super happy with this paint right now. Normally when you have a new gallon of paint, there isn't a bunch of junk in it, but there's a bunch of junk in this paint. So I'm gonna have to strain this, because I cannot have those chunks in there. You can get a regular paint strainer. If you have an old pair of pantyhose, that works great as well. Or if your wife has an old pair of pantyhose. I'm gonna go ahead and just strain this whole thing. All right, let's get to priming. Because I just painted the ceiling, that's probably the only line that I really need to cut in. You can get it all over the walls. Well, I can get it all over the walls because I'm going to paint the walls. So I'm gonna wanna try and cut this top line as straight as I can. And if it's a little bit off or I get any on the ceiling, it's no big deal, because I still have the ceiling paint, so I can just fix it. So what you want to do is cut everything in first, and then we roll it all out after the fact. Now I'm using a foam roller, and always start on the inside and work your way out. Then all you gotta do is repeat that process over the rest of the entire kitchen. Now it's finally time to put on some actual paint, and the color that the homeowner chose is a satin black. The process for getting this ready is going to be exactly the same as the primer. Now before I start, I do want to give you one little tip about foam rollers. Now you can see a lot of these foam rollers, they have this rounded edge. If you can find one that has a flat edge, they work much better for getting into tight areas, but it's not a big deal. If you can't, if this is the only kind that you have available to you, you can just take a razor blade and you want to cut that flat. And the reason you want to cut that flat is because when you're rolling, it allows you to get closer into the wall. or into the edges or wherever you need to roll, you can get closer and you can really make that edge turn out a lot nicer. This is going to be the exact same process as before. We're going to basically cut the insides, cut everything that needs to be cut, and then roll it out. You're going to always want to try and paint into a wet edge, meaning the areas that you just cut in with your brush, you want that edge to still be wet when you go over it with your roller. Obviously, sometimes this is impossible if you're working around a more complicated area or if you're just a little bit slower at painting. No big deal. Just try and feather out your wet edges so you don't have heavy brush marks underneath the areas you're going to roll, and you should still be able to get a perfect finish. The cabinets now have 2 coats of paint, and that part is all done. The next step is going to be to actually paint the walls, so let's get to it. The most important part of painting the walls is the straightness of the line between the wall and the ceiling. The best trick to get the straightest line is to look for the shadow line between the wall and the ceiling and follow that line with your paintbrush. You don't have to get it absolutely perfect on your first coat because you'll be doing a second coat and you can straighten up any imperfections then. In addition, if you slop some on the ceiling on accident, you can just take the ceiling paint and do little touch-ups after everything is dry. So I've gotten the kitchen back to a functional state. I still got to do the doors. I've got the walls all painted, but she doesn't really like the color. So I'm gonna have to repaint all the kitchen walls again quick. And here's the new dark forest green wall color. It's a beautiful color and goes really well with the black cabinets. Definitely a good choice. Now that all the actual wall painting is done, it's time to move on to the final piece of the puzzle, which is the backsplash. It doesn't really match with the new color scheme, so it's gotta go. So let's get to it. The first step in beautifying these tiles is to sand them down and scuff them up, followed by a nice little wipe down of isopropyl alcohol. And make sure to use a high-grade masking tape because these tiles are getting painted with a tub and tile epoxy. Last thing to do is mix the part A with the part B and the epoxy, and we're ready to go. Painting tile really isn't any different than painting a wall. Just cut in the edges, roll out the center, try not to leave roller marks, and put on at least 2 coats. When doing any kitchen project, it's always the details that matter. So, one of the last things I'm going to do in here before I start doing the doors is install new switches and plugs. So let's get to it. I won't bore you here with the ins and outs of electricity, plugs, and switches in this video, but if you're interested in that, I have other videos available with some of that knowledge in it. Now we're on to the final step. That's going to be prepping, priming, and painting all of the doors. Here you can see I've created a paint booth inside of the home. You're going to need 3 things to make this easier for you. Some type of electrical sander, a sanding block, and some scouring pads. Now let me show you how to use them. Even though we have 2 different kinds of doors, we're going to be prepping these exactly the same. I'm going to take the sander here, I'm going to sand all the flat spots. Then I'm going to take this scouring pad and get all of the rounded edges. Now all I'm trying to do is scuff this up so that the primer will stick. After each board is sanded, vacuum the dust off and set them aside. Just like when doing the cabinet frames themselves, make sure to take your time and get in every little nook and cranny. Dried up food, food oils, and oils from your hands are guaranteed to be on all of the cabinet doors, and we need these things to be completely free of all that stuff in order for the paint to stick. So one of the things we need to fix before we start actually painting all of the doors is the holes. So because we have 2 different kinds of doors, these holes are set at a different width apart and they're not set where we need them to be. So all of the holes on these black doors, I'm gonna go ahead and fill those in. I'm just gonna use a little bit of this Ready Patch and then fill the holes in on both sides. This stuff is super easy to work with. It's a little bit thinner than a silly putty consistency. Just push it in the holes as deep as you can with your fingers and then spread it out with a putty knife. It doesn't need to be perfect, the hole just needs to be full. After everything is dry, we just break out our sander to make everything smooth, vacuum off the excess dust, and then flip them over and do it all again. Now that everything's all prepped, we're finally ready for some primer. And if you watched my last kitchen video, you'll notice that I use this to paint all the doors. And while it did work fantastic, the only issue is that there's a lot of overspray and it puts the material on very, very heavy. So this time I've decided to try something a little bit different. I went out and purchased one of these. And hopefully it's gonna cut down on the overspray. Hopefully I'm gonna use considerably less material. So let's get to it. Straightening your paint is super critical when you're spraying it. If you have any little chunks or even tiny specks in the paint, it can clog your sprayer at the tip and you're gonna end up with less than desirable results. If you're gonna be spraying your cabinet doors, the best advice I can give you is to spray light coats and spray from all 4 sides. This way you don't have any misses in any of the nooks and crannies or bare spots on any of the edges. The primer dried fairly quickly, and now I'm moving right into spraying our beautiful black color on these doors. So I run into a slight problem. Now it's not a huge problem, but the sprayer that I was using worked great for the primer, but what I didn't realize was the paint that I had purchased to actually give these things a coat, which is like a urethane alkyd enamel. It says right on the can, do not thin. So the fact that I couldn't thin it means that I'm not getting the best, smoothest finish. So let me show you the finish that I've got. And it's not horrible. Probably looks worse on camera, but it's really not that bad. There's just a little stipple in it, and that's not exactly the look I'm going for. So I'm gonna go ahead and swap back over to the other sprayer and give these another coat on the back side. That's just why I did the back side first. And we should be able to smooth this all out. I'm sure you've noticed now I am wearing a full paint suit. And that's because there is a ton of overspray with this type of sprayer. And there's basically a fog in the room of paint particles that you can't really see on camera. But it does work well, and I'm able to get the finish I want. It's just 8 times the mess. Before I forget to mention, I am doing 3 full coats of paint on these doors, and that's gonna add durability and longevity. All of the doors are now 100% dry, and we are ready to put this kitchen back together. I got some nitrile gloves on to keep my fingerprints off of everything, so let's get to it. Finally, to my favorite part of any job, and that's the final install. I'm just popping the hinges on and putting the new handles on, nothing super complicated. Since I'm using the exact hinges that I removed from each specific door, I won't have many adjustments that I need to make to get the doors to hang properly and straight, unless they weren't straight beforehand. Well, that's gonna do it for this episode of Random Guy number 6. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.